Welcome back. Alright, so we made our given quantity is -1 when call add, then throw negative quantity exception unit test pass. However, -1 isn't the only invalid quantity. There are other invalid quantities. Your task now, for the next 15 minutes to say half an hour, is to write another unit test for a different negative quantity and then make that unit test pass. It'll be red to start with, and then you'll turn it green by changing the production code. So why don't you do that now, and I'll see you shortly. Alright, how did you go? Let me go ahead and create another unit test for a different negative quantity as well. So I'm going to copy the quantities -1 unit test. That is fine, as I've mentioned before, but when you do cut and paste, you've got to be very careful to make sure that we're making all the changes and we don't end up with inadvertent paste errors. So far we've got given quantity is -3, when call add, then throw negative quantity exception. I've just gone up to -3. I could have used -2 or -1000, but I'm just using -3. Okay, var cart is equal to shopping cart, that is fine. Action, add new product, -1. Okay, obviously we now want -3. Add should throw exactly negative quantity with message, -1 is an invalid quantity. Okay, that needs to become -3 as an invalid quantity. Cool. Let's just run the unit test and see what happens. Alright. Given quantity is -3, when call add, then throw negative quantity exception is failing. Why is it failing? Expect the exception message to match the equivalent of -3 is an invalid quantity, but found -1 is an invalid quantity. Okay, let's take a look. I think I know, and hopefully you know what's going on here. Here we're just throwing the negative quantity. This is not where the message is coming from. But when we come down to negative quantity exception, our negative quantity exception, we're hard coding -1 is an invalid quantity. We will need to change this. We will need to change it so when the invalid quantity is -1, it says -1 is an invalid quantity. When the invalid quantity is -3, it should say -3 is an invalid quantity. How do we fix this? I think a good way of fixing this would be to parameterize this constructor and kind of say, hey, int quantity. I could have called it invalid quantity as well. And then I'm changing the message like that. So this $sign is string interpolation, and quantity is this parameter here. So now it'll say when it's -1 is the invalid quantity, it'll say -1 is the invalid quantity. When it's -3, it should say -3 is the invalid quantity. Okay, we've got a compilation error. Throw a new negative quantity. Alright, we will need to put in our value here. While we can't put in -1 or -3 as a hard-coded value, because then it'll only work in one case for one unit test but not the other, we will need to make use of the quantity parameter over here. So it works in all cases. Alright, let me run the unit test now. Excellent. All the unit tests are passing. This is nice. Okay, great. Obviously, these two tests are very similar. They only differ in the invalid quantity value. Is there a better way to represent this unit test in a more concise, condensed fashion? Yes, there is. We can turn the unit test into a theory. When we turn a unit test into theory, it means we can parameterize some of the data that's coming into the test. So let's do this now. So turn that into a theory, and then the data that we want, so it's done by inline data, we want that to be -1 to start with. So at the moment we're just refactoring this test from a fact into a theory, and the -1 here is complaining because there is no parameter on our test, so we now need a parameter. I'm going to make that the quantity. And then wherever we were using -1 quantity, we now use this variable, make this a string interpolation as well. So I've made the unit test more dynamic, but really it's still the same thing. We're only using inline data of -1. Let's run the unit test again. All the unit tests. Let's run all the unit tests again. Okay, they're still all passing. Alright, so that's working with -1. So I'm going to now include, so down here we're using -3. I'm going to be using -3 as well over here. So we're now duplicating what's in the test down here. However, the naming of the unit test should change a little bit. Given quantity is -1, well, now it's not just for -1, now it's for all negative values, really, for -1 and -3 in particular. I'm just going to remove the -1. Given quantity is negative, when call add, then throw negative quantity exception. Yes, okay, that's nice and generalized enough and works. And I'm not removing the unit test down here, which also tests for -3, but as a fact, because I would like to see this one working first. So I'm going to run all unit tests now. Okay, brilliant, they're working. We can see a little triangle down here next to given quantity is negative. So I'm going to click on that and it expands into the 2 unit tests that are part of the theory. And we can see that at the end here because it says in brackets quantity -1 and below it quantity -3. And both these unit tests pass. Okay, good. So the -3 unit test passed. We can remove the other unit test that also tested for -3 but was a fact. Now it works for -1. It works for -3. Okay, our code. We've made it generic. We've generalized the code due to a second unit test. It would be good to sort of see whether it works for a third unit test, for a different negative value. I'm just going to say -20. Right, see whether it works for -20 as well, and it ought to work immediately. So let me just run this, running our unit tests again. Brilliant, and all unit tests are passing. Here we see the 3 unit tests that are given quantity is negative. For -1, -20, and -3, they're all working. I think what we've just seen here is actually something really interesting. When we initially wrote the first unit test for negative quantities, -1, we hard-coded the exception message to be -1 is an invalid quantity, because that's all we needed to do to satisfy rule number 3 of the 3 rules of TDD. Rule number 3 of the 3 rules of TDD is that we write the minimum amount of production code to make the failing unit test pass, and the minimum amount of production code is just a hard-coded value. But then we wrote a second unit test with a different negative value, and that meant that we needed to generalize our code a bit, make the code more generic so it would work with any kind of negative value. And then when we pumped in -20 as a negative value, it automatically worked. And there is a TDD rule which applies here. It's as the unit tests, as the tests get more specific, our code should become more generic. And we had that. When we had -1 for our negative value, we could hard code the value, and then with -3, we needed to make the code more generic. And with -20, it just worked. So as the tests get more specific, the code becomes more generic, or the code gets more generic. That is a great rule to remember. Let's move on.